So the principle behind chocolate here is that we ran this other test. We got a nice firm, nice hard test. That worked out great. We know that the chocolate is in temper. The principle behind all this is that we have actually six different types of crystals of fat in cocoa butter. It's what's called a polymorphic fat. Basically, we just want one of them, and that's the form 5. We call them 4,5 beta crystals, and they are active in here right now, and they're allowing the chocolate to harden at room temperature, and this would eventually become one solid bowl full of chocolate that is hard if left unattended. Because it does get thicker, and as we try to work with it, it gets even thicker as it starts to cool. We want to every so often run this over to the hot water and give it a stir. We don't need to leave it on the water very long. We're usually only trying to lift the temperature maybe 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but we need to keep it in something of a fluid state. If it gets too thick, it actually can not only put a thick coating around things like truffles, but it can also start to bloom. What's happening essentially is when chocolate sits unattended for a while, the cocoa butter starts to rise to the top, and you can end up with actually some gray, cloudy kind of formations that form on the outside. All that is cocoa butter. It doesn't mean the chocolate's bad. It just means that this cocoa butter has worked its way to the surface. And it usually happens because the chocolate was either too thick when it was being worked, hasn't been stirred often enough, or it was overheated. We have not overheated this, I know that, and I know I've been stirring it, but if it gets too cool, it could cause some fat bloom, as we call it. So I do go occasionally stop working, and I'll give it a good stir, and then occasionally I'll take it back to the fire, give it just a very quick 3 or 4 seconds on the warm water, just to warm up the bowl a little bit, and then to stir it back. Every time I do that, I'm also going to run a quick test just to be sure I haven't accidentally overheated it. What happens if you overheat it? Well, you end up with the chocolate being thrown out of temper. It actually gets too warm, and you actually melt the beta 5 crystals. So then we have to go back and start all over again, start retempering the chocolate with new seed and stirring and testing. So it's to our benefit to stir it often, stop what you're doing every so often, stir it, warm it up slightly. This is starting to get really thick, so I'm going to run this over to the hot water and give it just a quick stir. Okay, so what we've been doing in the meantime is I took some chocolate ganache, made my chocolate ganache, I poured it out into a slab, and you can see it's about a little over a 1/4 inch thick, and I chilled that so that it would stay nice and firm. And I took all the scraps after I trimmed it up, and I just sort of take the scraps and I'm going to roll these up. And as I roll them up, what I'm doing is I'm making the centers for some truffles that we're going to make. So each of these pieces I can just sort of squeeze and roll up with some gloves on. You can do this barehanded if you need to, if you don't have any gloves. Just wash your hands real well. So I'm just making round truffles out of all of the scraps. Now, what I'm going to do with that big slab is I'm going to cut it into squares, and we're going to bottom coat it with some tempered chocolate, and then we're going to be dipping that ganache into chocolate to make individual rectangular chocolates. These round ones, we're going to enrobe these with chocolate by just hand rolling them. This is a real traditional way to make truffles. Hand rolling truffles by rolling up the ganache. Now, some people in the past have taken ganache and they just roll it in cocoa powder, and that's fine. That makes a fine truffle. I like to use a half and half mixture of cocoa powder and powdered sugar. But if you really want these to last, what you do is you enrobe them with tempered chocolate. Now, I know it's more work to do it that way because tempering the chocolate takes effort, but if you do 2 thin coats of chocolate on the outside, you will get a lot better shelf life out of your truffles. They'll last for 2, sometimes even as long as 3 weeks. without refrigeration. That brings me to another subject when it comes to refrigerating chocolate. Refrigerating chocolate is kind of a bad thing to do. When you refrigerate chocolate, the moisture in the refrigerator is naturally attracted, well, the sugar in the chocolate is naturally attracted to the moisture that's in the refrigerator. And what ends up happening is little tiny droplets of water will start to form on your chocolate. When that happens, the sugar will get drawn out of the chocolate and form little crystalline structures on the surface. We talked about fat bloom earlier. Well, that was what happens in the refrigerator is called sugar bloom. Fat bloom can be solved because we can take fat bloom, remelt a bloom chocolate, and use the chocolate again because it's just cocoa butter that's on the surface, and it's just that sort of grayish, cloudy cocoa butter. But when it comes to sugar bloom, there's no fixing it. All you could possibly do after sugar bloom happens to chocolate is to melt it down and make ganache out of it. So I'm wiping off excess chocolate off my hands here. I'll clean off my knife. And to get nice square chocolates, I'm going to go ahead and cut this. And I think I'll cut this into thirds. And as I say, once we portion this out, we can then coat this with chocolate. A good practice when you're making dipped chocolates is to bottom coat your chocolate with tempered chocolate. My chocolate is getting rather hard here, rather firm because it's been sitting. I need to go rewarm this, but once we rewarm it, what I'm going to do is come back, and what we'll do is we'll bottom coat this slab of ganache. And the bottom coat, the idea is that if I coat one side, let that harden, then portion it, I can flip them over, and when we dip them in chocolates, you won't have a bald spot on the bottom because hardened chocolate will be on the bottom. And the idea there is that we preserve the shelf life of the chocolates because there's chocolate all the way around, and it's an even coat because I can control how thick that bottom coat is going to be. So while we first coat it, it's on the top, we flip it over, and that'll become the bottom. Okay, so let's bottom coat our ganache slab. What we're going to do is take a little bit of chocolate. I double checked this chocolate when I warmed it up to make sure that it was actually in temper. I didn't accidentally overheat it. So I put a little chocolate on there, and I'm just going to, this is regular chocolate on top of ganache. And the idea here is this is going to be the bottom. If we just coated ganache with chocolate without a bottom coat, every time we set down a chocolate, it would end up having a bald spot on the bottom. And a bald spot is a perfect opportunity for bacteria to find its way in. It's also a perfect opportunity for moisture from the atmosphere to find its way in. So to increase the shelf life of your chocolates, it's always good to put a bottom coat on them. So I'm going to go ahead and just get this smoothed out. Let's do the other small pieces. And the idea here is just to make sure that we've got a good seal all the way around this piece of ganache. You put a lot of work into chocolates, especially when you're making them by hand, so you may as well preserve your investment in time by making sure they're done right. So take some chocolate here, just spread it on one side. We're going to come back shortly when this chocolate has had a chance to harden. And we'll take a look at it. One thing you may notice already, this ganache is fairly cool, and this chocolate I put on is already starting to dull. It's getting from its glossy melted state to being sort of a gentle sheen, and that gentle sheen is an indicator that the chocolate is crystallizing. So we'll set that aside, let it harden. In the meantime, I've got all this melted chocolate. It's time to roll some truffles. So I'm going to give my chocolate a good stir. Just make sure it's well stirred. It's about as fluid as it's going to be with this type of chocolate. What we're going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of chocolate, I'm going to put it right in my palm. And we're going to take a piece of ganache and we're going to roll it in that chocolate. Now covering the ganache with chocolate like that can end up being kind of uneven. So what I do is I roll it off onto one hand and then roll it onto my paper. And I don't try to make this first coat very thick. I'm going to make 2 thin coats. So roll it off onto the paper. And by rolling it like that on your hand, some of the chocolate comes off on your hand. And that's good. That makes sure that the chocolate is even. It's of even thickness. Okay, so after going back and doing a second coat, here's how the truffles came out. They were allowed to harden, and they came out really nice. Truffles, after all, are named after the mushroom, the truffle, so it's meant to be kind of rough and kind of lumpy on the outside, but the portions should be about the same size, and these turned out just fine with using the basic chocolate from the chocolate chips with ganache center. Now on to the slabs of chocolate that we had made earlier. I had to replenish my bowl, and I'm waiting on a chocolate test right now. I had to melt some more chocolate, but This is my current test. It looks like it's going well. In a few minutes, that should be about ready. I switched over from the chips over to some basic baking chocolate. This is the semi-sweet baker's chocolate, and it mentions that it's 56% cacao, which is really good. That means it's got a large amount of cocoa butter in it. That's going to help it be more fluid and better for dipping. Because in order to do these slabs, we're going to want to be dipping them. Each one of these pieces of ganache has chocolate on the bottom of it here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these into portions for dipping. And each one of these then will become an individual dipped chocolate. See, that's the bottom. So I'm going to turn these over so that the bottom is the part that's coated with chocolate right now. When we dip them, they will be then bottom coated, and we won't have to worry about any bald spots. So flip them on over. Okay, so to dip these, let's check our chocolate, make sure it's in temper. It looks like it is. It's starting to dull here and starting to get that gentle sheen, which means the chocolate is tempered. And as we go to dip them, I'm going to use a standard fork. And what we're going to do is we're going to be move this all over a little bit so you can see what's going on. I'm going to take a bottom coated chocolate, here's the bottom, and I'm going to dip it in upside down. So plop it right in the chocolate upside down, take the fork, push it down on one side so it flips over, and then bring it on up. Now there's a lot of excess chocolate on here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bob it up and down, and when I bob it up and down, what happens is the chocolate becomes thinner on the top and on the sides. And then I'm going to take this and just sort of run off the extra chocolate on the bowl. I'm going to gently try to take that off the fork. Here we go. It's a little tricky at first. So here we go again. We're going to plop it in upside down. Make sure it's coated on the bottoms or the sides and the top. Flip it over with the fork. This time I'm going to make sure it's a little closer to the end of the fork so that some of it is hanging off the end of the fork. Bob it up and down. That's going to give you a nice thinner coating. Screed off the bottom. And then just carefully drop them over onto your surface. I've got this sheet pan here covered with a piece of plastic wrap, and that will work just fine. As the chocolate hardens, it will come loose from the plastic very easily. It's tempered chocolate that will come loose very quickly and easily. When chocolate's not tempered, it sticks to everything. There we go. Carefully take it off. I want to make sure that these look as nice as they possibly can. So I'm trying to make sure they look really nice with a nice clean border around them. Trying to make sure they don't have a lot of excess chocolate to pool at the bottom. So bobbing up and down, screening off the bottom, and then carefully placing them on the paper or the plastic. Flip it on over. Okay, I'm trying to make sure these end up with a little bit of overhang off of the fork so that when I go to take them off, they'll easily release from the fork onto the surface. The more care you take in doing this, the better your chocolates are going to look. I'm going to clean off my fork with a rag. I find with a lot of extra chocolate on my fork, it's really difficult to get the chocolates off of the fork. So I clean it off from time to time. Now, as these harden, you can garnish them. They're still wet, they're still soft at this point, and still melted chocolate on there. So this would be a good chance to garnish. If you had anything you wanted to put on top, let's say you wanted to put a pistachio on top of each of these, or if you wanted to just make a mark in them, you could. Marks are very common. This is something that's done in chocolate shops all over the country. They will take their fork, let's say, and make a series of marks. And they do this as a signature for certain flavors. So let's say I've got 3 marks on each one of these. And let's say these were vanilla, then all the vanillas would have 3 marks. What I could do then is I could say, okay, for other ones that I have, let's say some orange flavoring in them, I could do 2 marks, for example. Oh, every so often you're going to drop one. And if it drops, just try to sort out which side is up. Now this is where you have to pay really close attention to the thickness of your chocolate too. If the chocolate starts thickening up and cooling, it's time to stop working, go back over to the fire, warm up your chocolate, and get it fluid again, and then bring it on back. Do another test just to be sure that your chocolate isn't too hot and it hasn't been thrown out of temper. Once you get a good test, then you go ahead and start up working again. This one got stuck. I had to give that one a little bit of help. Okay, so let's keep going here. We're going to get these done. Another way to do the dipping is you can put it in bottom side down, and then just take your fork and enrobe it. Pull some chocolate up over the chocolate. And then just fish it out. Just try and make sure you're keeping the bottom side down so that you know which side is down. There it comes. A good sign here, the fact that I'm having trouble getting it off my fork is a good indicator to me I needed to clean off my fork. Okay, bottom side down. Screed off the bottom. Drop your chocolate down. If I do put it bottom side down, let's put it bottom side down in here. I press it down so it's just barely visible, and then I just enrobe some chocolate over it. Note where it's at so you don't lose it in the bowl of chocolate. Bob it up and down. screed off the bottom, and then drop your chocolate. Now that we've got that done, I'm going to go back here and I'm going to place these little marks. And all I'm doing with these, I'm just touching it with the fork just to create those marks. All right, I'm going to continue with the rest of this, but as you work on your chocolates in class, just post pictures after you're done. All right, so here's all the truffles. About 24 truffles altogether out of that small project, and then the chocolates hardened up just fine, and they look terrific. So give these a try. Have fun making these. I'd like you to make your tempered chocolate and make your ganache, and then go ahead and post pictures on Talon for all of us to see. And I think you'll have fun with this project. Tomorrow is Wednesday, and we will start with making a dacquoise, which is essentially a dacquoise sponge and a chocolate mousse filling. So that'll be our first finished dessert plated project that we'll be doing. So have fun with that as well. Keep an eye on Talon and on my YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see a demo of how to put together the dacquoise. See you tomorrow.